topics. Now, one of the companies that's been doing a fantastic job of monetization is Kongregate. This is Emily GREER from Kongregate. We can have applause for Emily now. And she's a data geek. She really likes her data. And every time she comes to these shows, she presents some really interesting and actionable insights into what she has learned about monetizing free-to-play games on Kongregate. And with that, we're going to kick off the morning with a full hour of Emily talking about monetizing games and the data behind it. Emily?
I forgot to turn it on beforehand. Lack of preparation. Sorry about that. Thank you for the kind introduction, David. As you said, my name is Emily GREER, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kongregate. And I'm going to be talking about maximizing monetization, specifically looking at virtual goods and free-to-play games. So because my talk is going to be very much based on our Kongregate experience and the data from Kongregate, I want to explain a little bit more about what Kongregate is so you understand where I'm coming from and what's driving this talk. So Kongregate is an open platform for free browser-based games, mostly Flash and Unity, but pretty much we'll take anything that's in the browser. We get about 15 million monthly uniques, core gamers, mostly, I think it's 85% male, 15 to 40, I think the average age is around 25. And we have about a little over 300 games currently active selling virtual goods. And that represents 85% of our revenue. If you've seen me do talks in the last few years, that percentage has been going up, and that's as our ad business is still doing well, which is about 15% of our business. We're also now a publisher in the mobile space, just free-to-play games. Our first titles are in test markets right now and are going to be launching globally, hopefully next week, but definitely in the month of August. So that'll be exciting, at least for us. So the great thing about having a platform is that you can do cross-game comparisons from all sorts of games. We work with big studios, small studios, Asian, Western, MMOs, social games, single-player Flash games, and it means you can really draw a lot of interesting conclusions from a great sample set. So. And one of the things we've learned is that monetization is really exponential. There is a very strong power curve of how games do. This chart shows all of the games on Kongregate ranked by lifetime ARPU from top to bottom. The median is only 8 cents, but the top game has an ARPU of almost $9, 100x. So this is a really, really, really dramatic difference. So the question that you ask is, what's driving this? What's the difference between the game that's doing, an $8 ARPU and an 8-cent ARPU? And there's some obvious explanations that have to do with genre, multiplayer elements, etc. But it's not just that. I limited the sample set down to one group of games, one group of multiplayer games that we have an excellent data set for, which is collectible card games. All of these games are multiplayer card games that monetize, that have PvP and monetize primarily on card packs and on selling card packs. And you can still see a pretty strong power curve in action with a top game at 350 and the bottom games down at around 0-cent ARPU. Another possible explanation is that some games are just better than others. Is it the quality of the game that's making a difference? And that, as an explanation, doesn't really hold water either. This is taking that previous chart of Kongregate games ranked by ARPU, and the orange dot is showing what that game's rating is. And you can see it's just this big cloud with lots of games with really high ratings not doing very well, and some games with really not low ratings, but lower ratings doing much, much better. And rating isn't a perfect equivalent for quality, but on Kongregate our users take rating really seriously. If a game gets a 3, that's pretty meaningful, that's a pretty good game. If it's 4, it's a great game, and anybody picking it up is going to think, this is fun, this is polished, etc. So the fact that there's really no correlation between your rating and how you monetize is also pretty fascinating. And just to be clear, ARPU, average revenue per user, is not the same thing as revenue, and ultimately we all care about revenue, but it's a pretty good proxy. If you look over at Kongregate games over time, most of the difference on revenue is explained by how long, between ARPU and revenue, is how long the game has been on the site. The variation in terms of like how many people play it is not nearly as big as the difference in ARPU. So what's going on? To get back into that, I'm going to delve into some sort of basic economic theory, and I warn you, it's 10 a.m. on a Thursday, and I'm sorry about this, but I nearly went to grad school in Econ before starting Kongregate, and I'm going to geek out a little bit here, but hopefully it'll be fairly accessible. So, almost all of you, I assume, have seen a chart like this, maybe not made by me in MS Paint, but somewhere in your education, it's the basic idea of supply and demand. And in perfect competition, the market price is going to be set where demand and supply are equal. The real life, really good example of this in the real life is the stock market, where the prices are constantly going up and down. But forget that chart. This has nothing to do with you. So, like, we live in a very imperfect world. So the idea of perfect competition assumes that goods are something called homogeneous, i.e. that there's no difference between buying from one supplier or another. If I buy a stock, I not only don't care who I'm buying it from, I don't even know who I'm buying from. It's a completely anonymous experience, and therefore the only thing that matters with price. But nobody can sell a game that's useful in your game but you. So it doesn't matter if another game is selling a totally awesome sword. I have no interest in that sword because I'm playing your game. Ignoring gold farmers, they actually could sell something that's useful in your game, but that's a different talk and not this one. So this means that your game is a monopoly. This feels a little bit strange because you're surrounded by competition, literally in this room. Look left, look right. It's a room full of people who are competition. And the competition for player attention has gotten so fierce that it's dropped the game price to free. But the market for in-game goods is separate. Players are not price shopping packages of gold between two different games and deciding which to buy. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. But you're a really insecure monopoly. Since players can leave your game and your market for goods freely, you're just in a very sort of tenuous position all the time. You're not a cable company that can charge high prices and provide shitty service and leave somebody on hold for an hour and they really can't do anything about it. That's not you. Players are, because players can leave at any time, you really need to treat them well and should treat them well, and that should be core to your business. What it does mean, though, is that you should look internally to your game to set prices, not externally. I feel like in the games world, there's a lot of sort of copycatting going on and a lot of sort of echo chamber going on where, okay, they're putting something at $1, they're selling this item at $5, that's what I should do. And maybe, but you don't know that they had it right to begin with. So you should look at your own data and your own experience to figure out what you should do. So how do I maximize my revenue in a monopoly? The good thing about being in a monopoly is that you can set your price freely. You decide how much you want to sell at what price. You can sell fewer units at a higher price or more at a lower price. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue that you get from a change in price. So an example is I can sell 5 units at $5 or 7 at $4, and I get $3 in marginal revenue for lowering that price. Your total revenue is going to be maximized where marginal revenue is 0. So how do I figure out where marginal revenue is 0? If this were an econ class, you'd get a formula and take a derivative, and that would be awesome. But the real world isn't like that, and all you can do is deduce it from trial and error, or if you're disciplined, do A/B testing. You change it and see what happens. So when you change a price, what are you looking for? And it's all about elasticity. When a good is elastic, quantity is going to decrease rapidly with a price increase, and your total revenue is going to drop. If a good is inelastic, then quantity is going to just decrease a little bit with a price increase, but not enough to compensate for the fact that the price is higher and your total revenue is going to increase. The classic example is gasoline. So when gas goes to $4 a gallon, suddenly Exxon is making record profits because everybody's still buying basically the same amount of gas, but the price is higher. And just to give you a visual, this is what it looks like in graphs. An elastic demand curve is going to be kind of flat and low, and an inelastic one is going to be steep and high. The area of the box is the total revenue, so you can sort of visualize, what's going to happen with revenue as you change in price. So which are virtual goods? Any guesses? Elastic, inelastic? Elastic? Any votes? Inelastic? Okay. Answer is mostly inelastic. And this is really important. So there's not a lot of price testing data out there. Most people, it's a hard thing to test because people talk in a community, in a game community, it's hard, it's a sort of uncomfortable thing to test. But there are some good natural experiments out there. One is a set of games called Bloons Tower Defense 4 and Bloons Tower Defense 5. I bet a lot of you have played it because they've been played just an absolute ton. Bloons Tower Defense 4 was the first to introduce virtual goods and was the first big single-player success that we saw in Kongregate. The game sold 20 items ranging from 30 cents to $10. Last year, Bloons Tower Defense launched, 5 launched with nearly double the items and prices ranging from 60 cents all the way up to $100, much, much higher. On average, the prices were 70% higher on comparable items. So what happened? Results, 92% increase in ARPU, just a 1% decrease in conversion, and overall an 88% increase in ARPU. How did the players react? Nope, they were completely cool with it. The rating of BTD5 is one of the highest on our site and higher than BTD4, and the revenue is much higher. So raising the prices was absolutely the right thing to do. There may be room upwards from where they went. Another example, and this is an example where they did do a really good A/B test, comes from Synapse Games and their game Skyshard Heroes, which is a competitive steampunk kingdom builder that's on both Kongregate and Facebook. So they were worried about their conversion, and they decided to test dropping the price of their main monetization element, heroes, 40% on cohorts of new users to see what happened. So they were right that it helped conversion. They got a 21% increase in conversion, but with a 40% price drop, that meant their revenue dropped 25%. So pretty clearly inelastic. I'm going to have more data from Kongregate about inelasticity, but in the meantime, I'm going to take a quick break to talk about some math, because I know you guys all wanted to get up at 10:15 and talk about things like logarithms, but it's important for what I'm going to do, and I want to set a good basis. So linear regression is a standard statistical method for modeling the relationship between two variables. I expect most of you have come across it at some point in the past. What you do is you take a scatter plot of data points with one variable is on the x-axis and one is on the y. You draw a trend line through it, and that trend line is the prediction of what value you're going to get for the second variable y based on a value of x. How far the scatter plots are, the points are from that line, shows how good a prediction that is. So if you see like a cloud, like a diffuse cloud of scatter points around the line, that means it's not a very variable x is not a very good predictor of y. If you see a tight formation right around the line, then it is a good correlation. And what you're looking for there is an r-squared value that's closer to 1. 0 means there's no correlation. So this is a really helpful thing in all sorts of ways. But it has some limitations. Linear regression doesn't work very well with exponential functions like the one we saw for ARPU, because that's a curve, not a line. But because power curves have this really neat property that they're scale invariant, you can turn them into a linear relationship by taking the logarithm of the values. So yes, logarithms, really exciting. But this is something you're actually all pretty familiar with. Everybody here in San Francisco is very aware of the Richter scale. And that is exactly this sort of technique. The Richter scale is a logarithmic scale of an exponential function. There's tons of small earthquakes and very few powerful earthquakes. A 7.0 earthquake is 10 times as strong as a 6.0 earthquake, but they created a scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 that makes it linear and easier for us to process. I'm going to be using that technique a fair amount today to look at monetization variables, because it's not just ARPU that comes in at that power curve. ARPU, percent conversion, all of that have that same basic property. So here's my first data chart. For those of you who've been to my talks before, you've probably seen me do a lot of bubble charts. Unfortunately, where the size of the bubble represents revenue, fortunately I had to give that up because there were too many data points and it was just turning into sort of like one undistinguishable mass. In this talk, I'm going to be setting a convention where if you see a dark chart, that means I'm showing you the actual values. If you see a light chart, that means I've taken the logarithm. So if you see a dark chart, that's got the real values, and you can peer at the axes and see what's going on. If the logarithm, if it's a light chart, just look for the correlation and the distribution. I'm also going to go through the data charts a little fast, but you can go back. I'll be posting all of this on our developer website, so you can go back and look at the details a little bit later. So this chart shows the minimum price that a game sells and its correlation with ARPU. So people often think very hard about, okay, what's my entry price point going to be? What's going to be that first time buyer package? What's going to be that first thing that somebody buys? On Kongregate, the values for that range from about 10 cents all the way up to $10, with the majority of games being at $5 and quite a few at $1 and $2. It's a little hard to tell here, but first glance, there's not a lot of correlation, and then the games that are pricing at $5 are doing a little bit better. If you switch over and take the logarithms and things and do a correlation check, you can see that actually there really isn't very much correlation between the lowest price you charge and your ultimate monetization. And this is kind of surprising given how much time and energy we put into it, but because goods are inelastic, that first price point doesn't really matter as much as you would think. To look at it the different direction, this is the max price, the max gold package size usually that games charge. This is a really big scale with some games going all the way up to 2,000. 2,000 is only Asian MMOs have done this. This is something that Western developers are not comfortable with. It's pretty rare to see a Western developer even go up to 300. Most games are in the somewhere in the 10, 50 range. Quite a few at the 200, 300, up to 500. So how does that correlate with ARPU? That correlates a lot better. This is a pretty good correlation. You may have noticed I've put this little meter here to give you a quick visual on what the correlation is. That this is correlated doesn't mean that I think if you go in and suddenly add a $1,000 price point to your game that your monetization is dramatically going to change, because correlation is not causation. But what I do think it shows is the maximum price that a designer is putting into their game reflects how much they think somebody can realistically spend. And if they think that somebody can realistically spend a higher amount, that definitely does mean that the monetization of the game is going to be better. The interesting thing is that min price doesn't even correlate with conversion. So here's the values on the vertical column, you can see the percent conversion to buyers, and on the horizontal, the min price sold. Again, there's no correlation between that the games that have a 10-cent ARPU, sorry, a 10-cent entry point or a $1 entry point don't have a higher conversion to paid than the $5. Correlation is not causation. If you took the same game and added a lower price point, you might have a higher conversion. But the thing is that other things matter much, much, much more for conversion than does that entry price point. So what does? Time in game. This is a graph showing the percent long-time players in a game, so percent of your players that play at least 100 times, and conversion rate. And the correlation here is quite good. So the longer that somebody stays in a game, the more likely they are to convert, and that matters much more than what the prices are. So to get back into back to sort of what's going on here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about demand curves. A demand curve for a game is really the aggregation of individual player demand curves. Everybody has a different sort of exchange between price and what they want to buy. So you can have a mix of people who are really sensitive to price and a mix of people who are not sensitive to price at all. Factors that shape the individual's demand curve is how much they want to buy a good, the desirability of it, in econ terms, utility, and their income and ability to pay. So a teenager might have a lot of desire for an item, but not much ability to pay. But demand curves are not static. A player won't desire goods from your game until they care about their status and progress. So on day one, they don't really want anything at all. On day 100, they may want everything. The longer they spend, the greater their attachment and investment. Everything really changes how they feel about a game. Their demand goes up, price elasticity goes down. Here's looking at it on the data. This takes all of our buyers and breaks them out by the number of times they've played a game lifetime, going from 1 to 900. Actually, it's not buyers, it's all players who've played a game. People who've only played a game once, only about 0% have converted. By the time somebody has played a game 900 times, 50% of them will have converted to purchase. So really, really high. But that's not the same. How many have converted by the time they get to a play is not sort of how fast they're converting. Because somebody who gets to 900 plays might be somebody who bought on the second gameplay. So looking at just how many times somebody plays before they purchase, the median is 28. And by 100 plays, you still only got about 70% of the buyers who will eventually convert. Just so you know, this is limited to our top 10 games. So a game that isn't going to do very well might have a different curve, but this is what sort of aspirationally you would want. So the way to think about it is that retention is security. In a monopoly, the more time somebody spends in a game, the more they value their status, their progress, their friends, and the higher the switching costs become to another game or hobby. So once you have them, you really have them. People tend to drop off very fast, quickly, but once you have somebody at 3 months or 6 months, you can probably keep them 6 years. And you see this in monetization. So here's that same graph of percent long-time players and ARPU. And even just a visual inspection shows that there's probably going to be a pretty nice correlation here. At the high end, games get about 7 or 8% of their players to 100 plays. And if you do a correlation check, the correlation is excellent, even better than just conversion. Okay. Going back to demand curves, the shape of a game's aggregate demand curve. So I was talking before about how a demand curve is the aggregation of all these little individual demand curves. So the shape of an overall demand curve is determined by the total number of players in a market. As you bring new players in, you're going to get more demand. That's sort of obvious. But the shape of the individual demand curves are very important. So you weight the ones that want the most, heaviest in the sort of aggregation. So what you end up with is a situation where if a market has a few people with really high, really inelastic demand, this can make the whole curve inelastic. So this helps explain that unintuitive feeling of why price doesn't matter. Because for most of us, we feel like price should matter. I react to price. Why are my players not reacting to price? And the answer is that probably 95% of your players react to price, but their willingness to spend, their willingness to do anything is really, really low. And the people who really want to buy are insensitive to price, so the whole thing is insensitive to price, even if it's only a few people. And this is because big spenders are a big deal. This is looking at our top 10 games and breaking out the buyers in those games by how much they've spent lifetime. Most people, as you would expect, have spent less than $10 or less than $50. About 5% have spent more than $500. But if you look at their share of demand, that 5% who spent $500 or more make up the majority of the demand. People who spent $100 or more make up 85% of the demand for the top 10 games. And that big chunk of people who spent less than $10 are just a tiny sliver. I mean, I'm not going to turn away 2% in revenue, but it's just not very significant. 4 of the top 5 games get the majority of their revenue from those from players spending 500 plus, and every single top 10 game gets the majority of their revenue from people spending at least $100. So because big spenders are such a big deal, I want to take a very close look at ARPU, which is average revenue per paying user. This chart has the values, is ARPU and ARPU. You can see that the range on ARPU goes from really low, $1, $5, all the way up to near 400 at the top end. I will say that the games at the top end tend to be Asian MMOs, the same types of games that are willing to put a $2,000 maximum price package in there. If you do a correlation check, it's really, really strong. Now this is going to sort of automatic because ARPU is if you multiply ARPU and percent conversion, you get ARPU. So very obviously, those values are going to be correlated. But the fact that this correlation is so tight, this is about as good a correlation as you're ever really going to see, means that ARPU is a much bigger factor in ARPU than percent conversion. And if you do this is a correlation check on the percent conversion, and you can see it's a lot more diffuse. It's still a good relation, I mean, as you would expect, but it's much, much weaker. A good conversion rate is a sort of precondition for good monetization. It's not sufficient. You need to have a really strong average spend per player, per buyer, to make it work. So you can break ARPU down into 2 components. One is the average transaction size, and the other is the number of transactions. So here's the values of the average transaction size for across players. Again, you can sort of, just a visual inspection tells you that there's a positive relationship where higher is better. Most of our top games are run in the 15 to 25 range, but we do have games that get all the way up close to 50. And if you do a correlation check, it's actually the average transaction size is just as important as the percent conversion as a factor in ARPU. It's definitely a good correlation. But what's even stronger is the number of transactions. This is the average number of transactions per buyer, starting at 1, going all the way up to more than 20 for some games. And the correlation is really, really strong there, much, much more important than the percent of players who are converting to paid. And this is what it shows is that big spenders are not about a Saudi prince coming in and dropping $1,000 in a day. I mean, that sort of thing does happen, but what it's really about is steady, continual investment from players at reasonable size purchases. This chart takes all buyers for our games who've been in a game at least 180 days and splits their spend out by day. And you can see that what's going on with the red line, which is our top games, that there's very steady linear increase in spending. Whereas for other games, there's sort of like a spike up and then it tails off. Some of this is because of retention problems. Some of this may be because after you've bought one thing, it doesn't make sense to continue to invest. But the games that do best are the ones where it makes sense for somebody to sort of buy on a regular basis, once a week, once a month, something like that. So what do players want to buy? Permanent upgrades, items that give real and permanent advantage in the game. Permanent upgrades outsell consumables and convenience and convenience outsell cosmetic items and content. Consumables tend to be in the 10 to 30% range of sales, much more frequently in the 10 to 15% range than in the 30% range. Energy systems are retention mechanics, not monetization systems. They're important, but for that reason, not for that. And what's going on is that feeling of impermanence reduces the value to a player. I feel if I buy something that's consumable, I feel like money's dripping away, that I'm throwing money away. But there's a sort of range of values there. For example, a consumable early in a game, maybe Clash of Clans or Backyard Monsters, where you're spending hard currency to speed something up. Early on, that feels like a convenience. But later on, when you're sort of deep into PvP and you're trying to get some advantage during a limited window, then and if you get that advantage, then you may get some permanent value, permanent benefit. Then that turns it more into takes it closer to the permanent upgrade type of range, and then you'll see it sell better. So I think there's a range there, but you need to think about it in terms of is there a long-term benefit to the player in terms of what they get. Cosmetic-only items sell poorly, though the way an item looks definitely affects the way that they sell. A real-life example might be a coat. I need to buy a coat to keep me warm, but I'm willing to spend more on one that makes me, that looks really good and makes me look good, makes me look cool. Content is a really tough proposition in a world of free. Only the people who get to the end of your game and run out of all the rest of the content are really going to be interested, and then there's still the friction of purchase. So you're going to get 5% of 5% at best, and it's really hard to have a business that way. One thing that people ask a lot about is how do you balance advantage versus pay to win? If you are selling permanent upgrades, don't people? If powerful items sell, a winning item is going to sell even better, right? But I don't think that's really true. It might do it temporarily, but it's probably going to break your game. Players want to achieve in the face of challenge, not despite it. And if you make it too easy for somebody to win, it feels cheap to them, and it feels unfair to the other players. So the way you want to think about it is that items can be powerful if they also require skill to use and are acquirable through very large amounts of play. In a very real sense, you're balancing between the time-rich and the cash-rich. So a teenager who can put 40 hours into a game can compete against somebody like me who can put 4 hours into a game but is willing to put a little money in at the same time. The other thing is an item doesn't need to be much more powerful to be compelling. A very small increase in the power, even as low as 1 to 2%, can be enough to make it attractive to a buyer in a competitive situation. The more that they care about the game, the more that they care about their status, the smaller the advantage needs to be for it to be compelling for them to buy. The thing that you need to be aware of when you're designing permanent upgrades and items into your economic system is that it's very easy to cap the amount a player can or wants to spend. An example of this might be in a shooter game where it's really attractive to buy a particular shotgun because it's going to mow everybody down. But if that shotgun is the only gun that you want to use and it works just as well on level 2 as on level 50, they're never going to want to purchase again. And you've really capped, you may have gotten $5, $10, $20 from them, but that's all that you're ever going to get. The ideal should be that players should be able to invest continually with a close to linear benefit. I'm still wavering on whether that's true, but very real benefit. A player's only going to continue to spend as long as they're really getting something for it. So here's an example of a game that's done really well on Kongregate. It's a game called War Tune, which is a very deep MMO RPG from China that's been brought to the US by R2 Games, who is very kind enough to share their sales by item category. You can see that there are more than 25 categories of items ranging from gems and gem socketing, mounts, wings, etc. here. And most of these categories have, 20, 25 or more items in them. So you can see that the amount of things that you can buy in War Tune is a lot. And interestingly, no single category dominates. The biggest category is 14%, but there's a lot at that same level. So each category is additive and raises the cap of what a buyer can spend money on. Some sharp-eyed people might notice that clothing is actually the second largest slice, and and I just said cosmetic items don't sell. In War Tune, the clothing actually gives you a very, very small stat boost, and very, very small. But that shows that a very small boost can still lead to meaningful sales in a game that people care about. So getting back to monopolies. In imperfect competition, companies can do something called price differentiation, where they identify customer segments by their price elasticity and charge them different prices. So if you have a group of customers who are not very price sensitive, you find them and figure out how to charge them a high price, and then you find the group that is price sensitive and charge them a lower price. A classic example of this are student and senior movie tickets or matinee tickets on movies, where you find where people are willing, find the bargain hunters and give them a lower price, but then charge 10 or 12 bucks for a regular movie ticket. So this can be done in games. And one of the best ways to do it is through well-designed upgrade paths. This allows you to charge low prices early in the game when people's demand is elastic, and then have it naturally scale both the power of the items and the price of the items as you go through the game in a very organic way. On the right, I've got a picture of a character in Crystal Saga here with wings, which they can have a very strong upgrade system there in that game for. So you can upgrade your wings with tokens and have a different chance of success based on that. As you invest more and you getting to level 20, it takes more tokens, and the tokens you can get through loot drops or buying, and they're 30 to 50 cents, so it's pretty inexpensive. But it takes a lot of tokens by the time you're getting to the highest level of wings, and there's some amount of luck involved, so it might not work. But the wings are very cool and powerful looking, and people chase them. So you're taking something that is cheap, fairly cheap, but making it to start with, but making it sort of expensive in the long term. Fusing new items out of old items adds another dimension by ensuring that even low-powered items remain valuable to a player, increasing the value of extensive collections. This can be very useful, particularly in something like a pet battler or collectible card game. And having systems like this on a diverse set of items can extend the opportunities for purchase exponentially. And that's what we're really looking for, and that's where the exponential curve of monetization starts to kick in. I mentioned briefly that there's a luck element to the Crystal Saga upgrade system. Luck-based purchases add an element of excitement while again creating price differentiation. An elastic player will pay a low price once at a chance at an item that they'd really like, but someone who's really inelastic is going to keep buying until they finally get the thing that they really wanted. And it's sort of a mechanic in itself that's entertaining. I think the best luck-based systems are ones that are more positive than the one you saw in Crystal Saga, one where you're always happy to get what you get, you're satisfied with your investment, but you have a chance of getting something good or better, so you feel like, you feel good, you feel good whatever you got, but you feel even better if you got something awesome. A good example and an implementation of this that I like is from Fifth Planet Games in their game Dawn of the Dragons. They sell something called expeditions, and if you buy an expedition, you get a random item, and there's 4 levels, and you have a higher chance at some of the lower level items, and then a much lower chance at the top items. One of the things I really like about this implementation is that it's really well labeled and clear to the player. Each item, as you mouse over, it shows clearly what percent chance that you have of getting it, and whether you can get duplicates. If you do a new item expedition, then you only get an item you haven't gotten before. So if you go through and keep playing, you're guaranteed to get the item that you want. This means that something that costs $2 to $3, each individual expedition costs $2 to $3, but you could spend $70 to $100 to clear the whole board and get what you really want. So it's very much creating that price differentiation. Expeditions drive nearly half the revenue in Dawn of the Dragons, and when you add in chess, which is another chance-based item, the clear majority comes from Gacha items. And Gacha is a Japanese term that people often use for this sort of luck-based chance and luck-based purchasing, and it's something that works really well in things like Puzzle and Dragons and other games in Japan. Another thing people talk about a lot are events and sales, and these are really, really important for strong monetization. They're very powerful. A good event and sale can spike revenue by 5x, 10x, kind of almost huge amounts. But you need to be very careful with sales in particular, but also events, because they can also be destructive. If demand is inelastic, if you put your currency out at a huge discount, you may really spike your sales because players are excited and it's a good value. But if they were going to buy anyway, you may just be moving their purchase forward and at a lower amount. And you also might be training them to wait for sales and wait for discounts and only buy at that lower level. So you want to be very careful to see on how you design your events, and also looking at the data to make sure that you're doing it right. The best events serve 2 purposes. One, and I think this is by far the most important, is that you want to energize committed players. These are the inelastic buyers, and give them more to do and more to spend on. Sinks. But you also want to incent non-buyers and lapse buyers whose demand is more elastic to spend and hopefully to keep on spending. An event that does both is going to spike revenue and then reset to a higher base because you've hopefully brought in some new buyers who are continuing to buy, and the demand of your inelastic group, your committed players and committed buyers, hasn't been reduced. So that's the pattern that you want to look for. So this has been a lot of theory, but we're also starting to put a lot of this in practice now that we're a mobile publisher. I want to talk about Tyrant, which is a CCG by Synapse Games that's been one of Kongregate's top games since it launched in March 2011. The retention and buyer percentage for this game has always been exceptional, but the ARPU is mediocre. It's above average just because it's a power curve, but it's about 70% below the average for top games, which it is a top game, but it's been driven by its popularity and its conversion, not its average spend. We're thrilled to be working with Synapse on the new mobile version, and it's given us a chance to get together and sort of re-examine the monetization systems and see if we can really raise the monetization as we take it to mobile. Some background on the web version. On the web version, cards are sold in packs like most CCGs, but you can buy strong cards directly on a limited time basis. So there'll be a promo for a week or two, and you can get, if you spend $5 or $7, you can get the card that you want. There are 4 levels of cards, but you're limited to 1 legendary card, the top level per deck. And multiples of cards have limited utility, and this means that there's not a lot of reason to kind of keep buying decks of cards that you already have. If you already have one legendary, you don't need another. Even if you got another, it would be sort of annoying because you couldn't really use it. And if you buy if you buy a pack and it's all cards that you already have, then you really can't do anything with it. So, it really kind of discourages the player from investing beyond a certain point. And you see that in the sales. This is a graph of Tyrant's daily sales over the last 2+ years. And you can see a lot of really sharp spikes. That happens whenever they release a new card pack. And all of their very enthusiastic players rush in and buy the new card pack. And then demand quickly drops back to what it was before because there's not a reason to keep buying. So the focus with the mobile version has been on increasing the depth of the card collection systems. First of all, cards can only be acquired through pack purchases and drops with no direct purchases. Also, any card can be gained through soft currency purchases or drops. In the web game, some of those cards that you buy directly could only be bought that way. So it meant that there were certain cards that the non-paying players were locked out of. So this has a couple of effects. One is it reduces the pay to win because everybody has access to the same sets of cards and has the same chance. But at the same time, it increases the possible amount that a player can invest, because if they're chasing a particular card, they'll keep buying packs to do so. The cards are upgraded through the salvaging of inactive cards. And each card can be upgraded with escalating costs up to 6x for top level cards. So this means you get one salvage. Right now you get one salvage point for a common card. A fully upgraded top level legendary card takes 750 salvage points. So you're going from 750 common cards, the equivalent. An effective 5th tier of card rarity is created through fusing specific combos of cards, and then that card can then be upgraded. So a fully upgraded fused card is going to be about 2,000 salvage points. So there's a really very steep curve going on there, but you have a lot of depth with a much more limited number of cards. So Synapse is not going to be blocked by the number of cards that they can create and balance. PvP has also been restructured to focus more on asynchronous combat against well-matched foes, where you're going in and raiding for resources. And also there's going to be a lot of month-long event cycles. So the results, well, it's still really, really early because we've only got about a month of test market data, but it's showing strong retention, higher conversion, and 2x the ARPU relative to the web version. And finally, mileage is going to vary. The right strategy will vary dramatically based on the type of your game and your monetization, and probably your audience. I'm speaking to what goes on with a core audience. Something that's younger, more female, it might be different. If your retention is poor and unfixable, then short-term monetization is probably your best strategy, and spiking something with a sale may be the right way to go. Again, if your demographics are younger or poorer, even in a core game, your demand may be more elastic. And if your base monetization is capped, events and sales are going to be less productive. But also, finally, remember that the most important thing to do is make a fun game that people really care about. Without that, there's nothing to leverage, and there's nothing to do. Your first goal is to make a good game. Monetization can be fixed. Fun is a lot harder to fix. Thank you very much. For more talks and this data, you can get this slide at developers.kongregate.com. We're thrilled to talk to anybody about working with us on mobile or on web. There's people here, or you can email us. You can follow us on Twitter, and would love for questions if there's time.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I didn't drink heavily last night, because I was actually able to understand a lot of what she said. So before we go into Q&A, because we have a few minutes for Q&A, I wanted to make a couple of announcements while you guys were still paying attention. There is a women's lunch today from noon to 1 in the Plaza Room, which is right around the corner from registration if anybody in the room is interested in attending. There also, for the first time, is going to be a closing mingle this evening in the sponsor hall after all the presentations are done. It is a shameless bid to keep you around all day by giving you free drinks at the end of the day, so please come and enjoy that. With that, any questions for Emily? Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really amazing. At one point you showed how much is from payer who pay more than $500. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of those pie charts, and they scare the hell out of me. Because in addition to how much they pay, I put how many there are. Mm-hmm. And that's personal tweak, if they know each other or not. What's the big cluster? Yeah. Basically, you have, depending on the game, 40, 50, sometimes 60% of all your money from one group of friends who can stab a finger, someone's little brother mentioned another game, go away. How is your CFO, how do you sleep?
You know, I'll see things, I'll see things about this, and I'll see, you know, analysts looking at Zynga and saying, oh, they're too dependent on whale spend. I think if you look at our data and think about it, that's a little bit like saying department stores and restaurants are overly dependent on their regular customers. Like, you know, yes, if you have a regular group of customers and you treat them, you know, if things go wrong and everybody quits, every business is in jeopardy. I think most businesses, if you look at it, tend to have a situation where a very significant percentage of their revenue is coming from relatively few people. Yes, you are in a situation where you're vulnerable to what happens with those people, but you know, as you know, that is business. That is, you know, any B2B service probably has a similar thing where they have one big client. That's kind of a fact of life that we all have to live with. And it just means that you need to, you know, really focus on making sure that, you know, you're treating your players well and keeping them as happy as possible. But life is uncertain, and this is sort of kind of an unavoidable dynamic. This is sort of the reality that is not really avoidable. Yes, you can design your monetization to not have those types of, you know, core groups and get money from people coming in, but it's just so hard to bring people in. I mean, think about how hard user acquisition is, how hard it is to get people through the tutorial. I'd rather be dependent on people who've already spent six months with me and have a real, you know, emotional commitment to the game. I think they're actually far more reliable than relying on sort of the outside world to continually bring people in to spend.
I think one of the other things that you mentioned was this idea of segmentation, right? Where you treat different users differently. And so, I mean, doesn't that to some degree help you diversify your risk?
A little bit, but I'm not comfortable with the idea, very, very comfortable with the idea of treating people differently. I think what I was talking about more was that allowing people to spend the amount that they're comfortable with spending. I think that, you know, a sense of fairness is really important to most people in the games that they play, and if some group of people is getting treated much better, it feels bad for the rest of the audience. And the non-buyers in a game are really just as important as the buyers, because they're creating the competitive environment, they're creating the social environment, and you really want to keep everybody. So I don't want to say that you should be treating, you know, non-buyers or buyers differently, or even, you know, lesser spenders and greater spenders very differently. Though, I mean, we do have a tag on our customer service that, you know, flags something, flags up people who've spent more than $1,000 to make sure that we answer their tickets very quickly. But we're trying to answer every ticket within 12 hours anyway. So it's just a question of a slight difference in priority.
Emily, thanks so much for the talk. I'm curious, do you think that the data you've seen so far on the web is going to translate one-to-one to mobile? What would be the correlation in your mind?
I'm hoping to do a talk, be able to do a talk next year where I can speak to that. You know, I think the basic dynamics are going to be very similar. Ultimately, people behave. You know, gamers are gamers. The games are not that different, and people behave more alike than differently. Where I do think we'll see a difference is on conversion, because stored credit cards are amazingly powerful, and I can't see how, and I think on iOS where Apple is forcing kind of everybody who installs things to have some sort of payment method there, that you're going to see a higher conversion because the friction is reduced. There's also going to be a little bit of a different dynamic because Apple and Google tend to limit the prices at $99, and they're putting a little bit more friction into to the heavier spending. But I think that's a pretty marginal change because I think people will just string their 99 purchases together, and a whale is a whale.
I have a question over here. Thank you for your thoughts. I'm actually curious to know your opinion on how an app developer can utilize both in-app purchases and advertising. So segmenting the users is, without cannibalizing those who are going to make purchases and those who are not, the 95% who aren't spending. How can we find a balance to be able to monetize those additional users through offer walls and advertising without risk cannibalizing?
Yeah. So that's something we definitely are kind of work through on the web. It's important for us to keep having revenue for developers that aren't, we have 70,000 games on the site, and we're sharing revenue with all and only 300 games that are selling in-app purchases. So we want to be creating a revenue stream for all the games. So advertising is still definitely an important part of our business. We definitely are a little less aggressive. For example, on our games that sell virtual goods, you won't see pre-rolls, whereas you will in front of other games. And we try to do a lot of sort of, we're working towards situations where it's like kind of a pull advertising where you get in-game currency for watching a video. Offer walls are something actually I'm a little uncomfortable with because we found when we redesigned our purchase screen, we were testing two different versions of the offer wall, one of which was more prominent, one of which was less prominent. The one that was more prominent increased offer revenue, but decreased overall revenue. Because we were sort of diverting people into a more friction-filled way of purchasing, and what you really want to do is get them to a credit card, get them to a PayPal, something direct where they'll continue to spend. I think offer walls are really there for people who really only make sense in situations where people aren't going to convert anyway. So I like to have them for the teenagers who don't necessarily have a credit card, et cetera. But those aren't the people that the offer wall advertisers really want. So I think it's a relatively limited utility. I think advertising is great. I think the way to think about it is if you can put the ad sort of later in the game and on exit points, so exit ads are a great moment because that's when people are sort of open to playing the next game and not disrupting your experience. But if you're doing in-app purchases right, that should be totally dominant in terms of your revenue, and that should be your focus.
Thank you very much, Emily, for a very insightful and actionable